You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
About 25 years ago, I met a gentleman named Bob Eoff, and Bob at that time was the treasurer of the Constitution Party, and he was also the president of a local bank in my area where I was living in Texas at the time. And I got to know Bob, and what struck me about him, not only his very strong political conservatism and his staunch advocacy for the Constitution, hence his involvement in the Constitution Party, but here Bob was a career lifelong banker, and he understood what a lot of patriots understand. In fact, he understood it on a level a lot better than the level that we understood it on, because he was actually involved in banking. And so he understood how the Federal Reserve System and fractional reserve banking and the Social Security system, he understood how these were basically Ponzi schemes. But, of course, they're government-sanctioned Ponzi schemes, so who's going to prosecute them? He was also very helpful to several in the Patriot community because he could help people who did not have Social Security numbers to be able to open up bank accounts and to be able to do some things that they otherwise found difficult to do. And another thing that Bob did was Bob, as he came to realize that the Social Security number was what he came to realize that it was, and came to realize kind of the scam that all of that was, he started living without a Social Security number. And of course, the result of that was he ultimately found himself unable to renew a driver's license, and now has lived for over 20 years without a driver's license. And so he's been very helpful to several in the Patriot community, helping them to be able to negotiate these things. And so I just think that Bob will be a very interesting guest. Of course, he is one of our Dixie Heritage subscribers. Bob and I were going to SCV meetings together, way back 20 years ago in Texas. But I really do believe that this will be a very different interview from the ones we're normally doing here on the Dixie Heritage Hour. But if you just want to see how the banking system works, if you want to understand a little bit about economics that maybe get a new based understanding, something that you don't presently have, if you're in the Patriot community and you just want to find out a little bit about trying to negotiate through the American life without something like a Social Security number or a driver's license, you'll want to listen to our interview with Bob Eoff. I think you'll find it interesting. So let's go ahead and cut to that interview.
Bob, how are you today?
Okay.
Why don't you start by telling us basically how long you had been, I know you're retired now, but how long you had worked in the banking industry?
41 years.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been in banking 41 years. I retired about 9 years ago. And all that time it was family-owned banks, not the huge mega banks or the Fed.
So how did you get into the banking work?
Well, my dad was a lifelong banker, and my parents actually met in a bank, well, two different banks. And my dad they used to call what they called runners back in Oklahoma City, and where he would, they'd bag up the checks from one bank, and he would run and take them to the bank next door, and they would swap checks.
And so how old were you then when you started doing that?
Well, let's see. I got in banking in 1968. Then I graduated from college in 71 and went to work for the Treasury Department as a assistant national bank examiner, and that lasted about 2 years. Did lots of traveling, and so from that point on, I got into, I guess you'd call it mainstream banking, only small banks.
Did something happen when you were doing that work as a young man that gave you the passion to be a banker, or just one of those jobs that you never got another one, or how did that work out for you?
Well, when I was a bank examiner, that's a big stepping stone to go to work for a regular real bank, because those bank examiners are highly respected, and you get training pretty doggone fast. But I enjoyed being a banker, and the last bank I worked at, I was actually the president and CEO, but it was a small hometown bank, only about, I think we had 18 employees when I left.
Was that the bank in Navasota, or was that another bank?
That was the bank here in town where I live in Princeton. I was at the Bank of Navasota for 10 years. And it sold out to Prosperity Bank shares.
Okay. So
2 years back.
So then, as late as 9 years ago, there were still independently owned banks then that weren't part of the Federal Reserve System.
Right. There's still quite a few, mostly in Texas, but they're scattered all over the country. But I think Texas has more than any other state of local hometown banks.
I mean, obviously, at some point, you figured out how banking worked and made the decision to be a part of independently owned banks rather than the larger banks.
Right. Well, you get to wear more hats that way, and you get to meet more customers and treat people like people, and kind of the approach where you can help your neighbor with that part of it.
How old do you think you were? Or when do you think it was in your life that you started to figure out how banking really worked?
It was pretty early on. I mean, I know all the mechanics of it, how they make money, or in some cases lose money. I was a independent consultant for about 5 years. A couple of those banks I was actually served as temporary or interim president, if you will. That's back in the late 80s when banks were closing left and right every other Friday. And matter of fact, let's see, I was interim president of 3 banks, and only 2 of them failed, and they were on the closed list, but one of them stayed open.
So how did that happen?
Well, it finally turned around, and I was interim president of one bank down in Mahia, Texas, and they had bought some bonds several years ago, and those bonds cratered up. The bank examiners came in, actually upgraded management, and then the next week they immediately closed the bank because it was out of capital. That's unheard of, to upgrade management and then turn around and close it.
Right. In your office when I met you, and this was probably 20 years ago now, I remember that you had a silver dollar in your office and it was framed, and then next to it you had a Federal Reserve note and it said real money, fake money.
I remember something along those lines, and I still carry a silver dollar in my pocket, and every time I get it out of my pocket, it's like a cashier, they'll look at that and say, "What in the world is that?" And I'll show it to them, let them hold it, and I'll say, "Well, that's real money, not that phony money I just handed you." And they'll say, "What? What are you talking about?" And I also carry around a silver certificate in my billfold, and I always like to give it a lesson about silver certificates because they were once backed by real money. And they make the definition of a promissory note, but the Federal Reserve notes you carry around in your wallet today, I call them fraud notes because that's what they are. They don't even meet the definition of a promissory note.
When was it and how was it that you came to realize that reality or that truth between real money and fake money?
Oh, gosh. It was over a period of time. It's been, probably 20 years ago at least. But I didn't learn it overnight. I took some study and had to keep an open mind about it. But I'm one of the few bankers that you will find around that doesn't mind calling the Fed for what it is. It's not federal, and it has no reserves.
So did you take a lot of flack for educating people on the difference between real money and fake money, especially given the fact that you were actually one of the officers of the bank?
It surprised a lot of people, but surprisingly, almost everyone, even though they were surprised, and stunned a little bit, they accepted it as truth, and they could tell I was sincere in it and knew what I was talking about. So I'm glad that I got to educate a lot of people over the years.
I'm just going to use the word fraud of the banking system. And maybe that's not the best word. Maybe conspiracy would be a better word. Maybe there's an even better word that I'm not able to articulate. But that whole fraud or that whole conspiracy, if you will, that is the banking system. I know it goes a lot deeper even than real money versus fake money.
Well, I think I know what you're alluding to, and that's what a lot of people call the fractional reserve banking system. It's not exactly a Ponzi scheme, but they only keep about 10% of their assets or deposits in cash or near cash, and so they are able to leverage and loan out or invest or even more than they have on deposit, and that gets a little tricky. But I think that's what you're referring to.
If we didn't have the fractional reserve banking system, in other words, you can't create the fake money without the fractional reserve banking system, or maybe you could educate me and explain to me how banks could create real money using that system. I just fail to see how it would work.
It would be next to impossible to create very much money without the fractional reserve banking system. I suppose you could do it a little bit, but with the fractional reserve banking system, you can multiply that, tenfold approximately.
Right. Just to kind of illustrate it a little bit, my grandparents, they're both dead now. They both passed within the last 2 years. But they bought their house in 1948, and they paid $6,000 for it.
Right.
And when they died, their house sold for over $300,000.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
And that appreciation is what we would call it. But really, that was just gross inflation.
Right, exactly.
And so you say that like fractional reserve banking has made it so people can afford stuff. Has it really, or has it just made it so that people can indebt themselves for stuff and everything costs a ridiculous amount more than it used to because of inflation?
Well, I think you may be talking about two different things. Inflation's one thing in general, unless they were to inherit a house. Very few people could afford a house without being able to borrow long term. Maybe a few could, if you won the lottery, I suppose. But I'd say few and far between can afford a house without a long term loan, and that's largely due to fractional reserve banking.
Of course, people don't perceive it as inflation, as we talked about the increase in the illustration I gave of the property value of my grandparents' house. People would not see that as inflation, though it really is. They would see that as a capital gain. I remember years ago you had told me that the government manipulates the inflation number intentionally so that people won't see the inflation for what it is, and of course the result of it.
If you listen to the federal government, they'd say it's only 2 or 3%, but of course that's misleading. I think it was Alan Greenspan that told. I think it goes as far back as Ronald Reagan. He told Reagan one day, he says, "Hey, look, I know how we can lower the inflation rate, at least the perceived inflation rate." It says we'll just take out groceries and gasoline out of the basket. And anyway, Reagan apparently was dumb enough to be fooled by it. He said, "Okay, let's do it."
My own study of history and banking, and again, it's nowhere near as detailed as yours is. I didn't see a lot of inflation in this country until Lincoln started issuing greenbacks. And then when we went back to hard money, again, inflation was next to nothing until after the Federal Reserve Act was passed, but especially not until the Depression, when Roosevelt started taking people's gold away. And as people transitioned more and more from hard money to paper money, those were the periods in our nation's history when I saw the inflation.
We've always had inflation to some degree, even long before the Fed was created, and the income tax and real money versus paper money. It's varied from year to year due to various circumstances. It's been around for a long, long time, and I don't see us ever getting rid of it.
And I'm not talking now about fractional reserve banking as a system, but I'm talking about the system that we have in this country, the Federal Reserve System. Not only the way it's set up, but who controls it, who owns it, and so forth.
That's a good question. I'd say most countries have something very similar to the Federal Reserve in their own country. Like I said before, the Federal Reserve is not federal and it has no reserves. And there's two classes of shareholders. One is the banks, and other financial institutions, they own, I think it's called Class B shares. The mysterious part is Class A shares, and I don't think you could find out who exactly the Class A shareholders are, but it's been widely reported over the years that the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds own a substantial part of the Class A shares. But I don't think you can actually find out that. I think that's the Fed considers that top secret, and so they don't like to tell anyone about it or even breathe about it, and so it's next to impossible to find out. But the Fed, obviously controls interest rates. and that's a little scary in itself that they have so much influence over the economy. You know, every word they breathe. It's too bad we don't have a little more free market. You know, years ago, I think most people know what the prime rate is, and years ago, one bank would raise or lower their prime rate in one part of the country, and it's usually not the same one, you know, leading the pack, and then lo and behold, you know, a couple of days later, someone would follow suit, and a couple of days later, it'd be, you know, a dozen or so banks raise or lower their prime rate in lockstep. But today, everybody just watches one thing, and that's the Fed, when they wave their hand and say, okay, raise your rates. Everybody does it in lockstep. Or if they say, lower your rates, they just get in lockstep and do it. There's no free market anymore in that regard.
So why don't you explain exactly how, you know, we talked earlier about the creation of money. Why don't you explain exactly how money is created?
Banks do it because of fractional reserve banking. In other words, if a person makes a deposit, take me back a while now to think this through. When someone makes a deposit of, say, $1,000, well, they'll turn around and loan out, say, $800 to someone. And then that person will turn around and put the $800 back into the banking system, at least for a few days, and maybe keep, you know, half of it on deposit while they spend half, and, you know, it goes up and down. But anyway, they loan that money out. Or, you know, it gets a little smaller every time. Rarely does anyone, you know, make a loan and put it on deposit and then just let it sit there. They're going to spend it, but their balance is going to go up and down. But that enables the bank to loan it out, you know, a little at a time or fraction by fraction, and so they create money out of thin air that way. But only banks can do that very effectively. Individual might could do it a little bit, but on a much smaller scale.
And what about the actual creation of paper money? How is that created?
The Fed, the Treasury Department prints it, the Bureau of Mint and Engraving, and then they, under the Fed's direction and control, then they turn around and sell that to the U.S. Treasury, but they charge interest for it. I think the actual creation of the paper money, I think it used to cost about, I want to say 3 cents, and no, it might have gone to 4 or 5 cents by now, but anyway, it doesn't cost much at all for the paper to be printed, but they put it in circulation, and it's called being monetized. There was a time back when Kennedy was president, he authorized the U.S. Treasury to print notes themselves and not go through the Fed. It's called a United States note, not a Federal Reserve note. In fact, they were $5 bills, and matter of fact, when I was a teller about 100 years ago at a bank, I actually got one and still have it. But then we all know what happened to Kennedy. I think he was on to the Fed, and some of the people at the Fed didn't like it, of course. But, you know, they didn't want to face up to the truth. And like my good friend Rand Paul and his dad Ron Paul have tried unsuccessfully for the last several years to audit the Fed. And, of course, the Fed, I don't think they ever needed or had any lobbyists before a few years back, but now they have a multitude of lobbyists, and they have a big influence on people in Washington, and so they don't want to be audited or exposed for their manipulations and all their shenanigans. But I think that movement from Rand Paul is gradually gaining steam, and hopefully they'll be audited someday. I'm not saying that the Congress or any one person or committee should take the place of the Fed, but I think all the Fed's actions need to be exposed at least.
Right.
The Fed's capable of doing a good job in monitoring the economy and controlling the economy within reason, but it shouldn't be a deep, dark secret.
You know, constitutionally, some would argue, and I know Ron Paul would argue this, and you'd mentioned Ron Paul, and for years you lived in his congressional district. I believe you did, didn't you?
For about 2 years, but I got to know him over the years pretty well, and he and his brother Wayne Paul, who lives in Tyler, Texas. I actually know Wayne a little bit better than Ron, but I used to see Ron every once in a while. He'd come to Dallas, and back when he was campaigning, and then here a few years back, he brought his son Rand Paul with him when Rand was first campaigning, and so I got to know Rand a little bit, but I've always known his father much better. But I highly respect them both, and I don't think either one of them can be bought off by anybody.
I know that Ron Paul would argue that the whole Federal Reserve System is just simply unconstitutional, that, printing money and selling it back to the government at interest is just a totally unconstitutional system and should be abandoned.
Yeah, that's what Ron Paul believes, and I'm sure he's sincere in his belief. But Congress did it back in 1913, and one would argue, well, they can't pass along that authority and that responsibility and that duty, but they darn sure did. And now it's been over 100 years. I guess it remains to be seen how well it or how bad it works out. But I'm afraid it is what it is, and I doubt there's a whole lot we can do about it other than audit the Fed and expose the Fed. I wish we could go back to sound money, or at least money that was backed by real money, like we used to have the legitimate Federal Reserve notes that were backed by real money. And by the way, there's a big difference between lawful money, fiat money, legal tender. There's a big difference between lawful money and legal tender. Legal tender is just a facade. I don't know how they came up with that. It's just under a color of law. Lawful money means gold and silver. Like you and I have seen some lawful money over the years, paper money, but it says lawful on them. But they're you can't find them nowadays. They have to be they're collector items. And if you were to walk into the Federal Reserve Bank today and hand them one of those old notes that says lawful money or silver certificate, or even have a couple that say gold certificates, chances are they would grab that out of your hands and hand you back a Federal Reserve note. Say, here you go, sir. Have a nice day.
Right.
Lawful money or gold and silver certificates, they say on the face, redeemable in gold or silver at any Federal Reserve Bank. Nope, not today. They would laugh at you.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
For a number of years, you were the treasurer of the Constitution Party.
That's right.
And I would guess most of the people in the Constitution Party would have probably held to Congressman Paul's position on the constitutionality of the banking system as we know it today.
Oh, yes. I'm sure most of the Constitution parties would absolutely agree with Ron Paul and the platform in general, which speaks to that issue and pro-life issues and some other issues. Reminds me of a man named Joseph Sobran, who was our vice presidential candidate back in the year 2000. He spoke at a conference in San Antonio that I attended, and he gave a nice talk, and he repeated over and over and over again, I'll never forget, he said, the Constitution is no threat to our form of government. Let that sink in for a moment.
Right.
It's no threat. In other words, it's totally ignored. A lot of politicians nowadays continually refer to our form of government as a democracy. It's not. But if you're headed that way, it started as a republic, not a democracy.
So I get the impression, talking to you, that you do not see the banking system as necessarily an enemy of our government, whereas I would say a lot of people who would share the remainder of our political ideology would.
I think you're on target, yes. I don't foresee it as an enemy, and I doubt very many people do. One thing I'm concerned about, I was there during the Y2K years for a little while, but that blew over. But I'm concerned today about the collapse of the banking system. And I hope that doesn't come to pass, because very few people are self-sufficient. And even if a person had a lot of gold and silver coins, you can't hardly carry them around, and you would still have to, barter and go to your neighbor. Maybe you've got goats and your neighbor has milk or something along those lines, but you can only go so far and to find so many neighbors to trade with. So I'm a little bit concerned about the collapse of the banking industry. It's, a lot of doomsayers have been talking about it for years, but with the national debt just mushrooming, hour by hour, minute by minute, and I don't see how that can continue forever with the national debt. So that concerns me, but and the banking industry, feasibly could collapse overnight, and then your paper money or money in a checking account, might become near worthless overnight.
So what do you think is the likelihood of such an overnight and unforeseen collapse actually happening?
Oh, I'm scared to even think about it. I think it's possible, but I just hope and pray that somebody sees it coming, and be like the watchman that's mentioned in Ezekiel. I'm sure there's a few people, a handful, that know if and when it's coming, and hopefully, it will leak out in due course. And who knows, if God allows, maybe there's a chance for correction if we'll repent and get back on track and not kick God out of our country in the public square like seems to have been happening over the years.
Have you ever read any of James Rickard's books? I ordered a book yesterday that I have not read yet. Obviously, it hasn't come in the mail yet, but it's called The Road to Ruin by James Rickards.
Oh, okay, James Richards. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, I've seen him on the internet. I don't think I have that book, but yeah, he's one of the doomsayers. There's quite a few of them out there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think he's fairly reliable.
Okay, because he's saying that there is just such a planned destruction of the banking system in the works, and it's just a matter of the right person giving the go ahead, and basically everybody around the world will wake up and they're not going to have money anymore.
Right. Yeah, of course. Well, I think James is, he's a respectable person, but if I'm wrong, tell me. But I think he's been saying that along with some others for at least the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, and seems like nothing ever changes.
Is it possible that the reason that some of these schemes never come to light is because they get exposed, and then once somebody's able to expose them, they're...
Well, that's possible. Of course, if the U.S. banking system collapses, more than likely that would cause other countries' banking systems to also collapse, and possibly vice versa, because we're so dependent on each other. And I really like the book. Maybe you've heard of it, or I can send you a copy. The Day the Dollar Dies, and it's by I can't think of his name now. I've got a couple of copies. It was written back in, I think, the late 60s, the early 70s, and it's quite an interesting read. I think he was a little far ahead of the future, but it looks like more and more he's right on target. And he mentions over and over and over in his book, which I found extremely interesting. He's an evangelist. I'll think of his name here after we hang up, I'm sure. He mentions over and over in his book, Revelation 13, chapter 16, about no man can buy or sell unless he has the mark of the beast or the number of his name. And I see that coming. I see that, inch by inch, but I really feel like it's coming.
So do you see the Federal Reserve System and the Social Security system? I know you see the Social Security system in that light, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But do you see the Federal Reserve System as part of what's going to bring that about, or?
Oh, yeah, I think the Federal Reserve and the Social Security system are playing hand in hand and will likely continue to do so. Absolutely.
So, well, we've talked about banking.
Yes.
And kind of some of your history and your background in banking. I'm guessing it was your work in banking that caused you to kind of see the truth about the Social Security number.
Yeah, I think it eventually led to that. Although, the two are definitely intertwined. And the short answer is yes.
So how did you come to find out, and we'll talk about the Social Security number, the particulars of it, but how did you come to find out, what was your journey for discovering the truth about the Social Security number?
Okay, well, before we get off the subject of banking, I mentioned about a book called The Day the Dollar Dies, and I read it several years ago, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, 2 or 3 times, but the author's name is Willard Cantillon, Cantelon, and it's a great book. I mentioned he was an evangelist. The book was written in 1973, by the way, but he was way ahead of his time. And it's a great book, and he mentions in there about Revelation chapter 13, verse 16, about no man can buy or sell without the mark of the beast or the number of his name. And it's a great book. It's online. You can get it from Amazon I'm sure for under $10. You can get the original version or a little bit later version, but I highly recommend it for people that are interested in the subject of banking or the mark of the beast.
I'm guessing you could still find that book on Amazon and maybe on eBay and a few other places.
Oh, yes, definitely. It's been around for years. And a good friend of mine, he's my best friend. He's only 95 years old, but a retired pastor. He recommended it to me, about 10 or 12 years ago. He's right on target, but he was about 30 years or so ahead of his time. But we're coming to see it pass.
So how did you discover the truth about the Social Security number? I mean, what happened that caused you to not just take that for granted and to start thinking about it?
Well, that's a very good question. I guess I've been fighting this battle for 25, maybe 30 years. I say battle. I guess it didn't start out as a battle, but it's been a battle for me personally for the last 15, maybe 20 years. But thinking back on it, I think I first learned about the Social Security number back 35 years ago, roughly, when I used to get mail from the University of North Texas, where I graduated in 1973. And I used to get a newsletter from them, once a month or so. But on the envelope, it had my Social Security number. Back in those days, the Social Security number was your student ID. And I remember vaguely, it's been a long, long time, 35, maybe 40 years ago now, I wrote them a letter and I said, hey, you shouldn't be putting my Social Security number on the front of an envelope that you mailed to me. And I don't think I ever got a reply, but it seems to me, as I recall, within a year or two, they stopped doing that. And they changed the number or shortened it or something. So somebody up the line must have taken heed to that. And ever since, my interest in the matter has just grown and grown and grown. And I probably know too much on the subject. If you could know too much on any subject, I wish I knew a little bit more about the Bible sometimes like you do, but sometimes we get engrossed in a particular subject, and like somebody said, we have to pick and choose our battles, and this particular battle is the one I have chosen as a personal matter.
So I know that there are a lot of people, especially in the patriot community, who have abandoned or in some cases never had, or in other cases they had one and just stopped using or had tried to repudiate or, different variations of this. But there are a number of people in what we'll call the patriot community who have gotten rid of their Social Security number as a means of not paying taxes but that wasn't your motivation at all, or was it?
No. I firmly believe in paying taxes, especially for constitutional purposes.
Right.
And I don't mind, the Social Security number per se, if it's used for the original intended purposes, and that's for taxes and dealing with the Social Security Administration. But when it becomes so widely used and expected and demanded from so many people, then that's where I crossed the line.
I remember, I believe you were the person maybe 20 years ago who pointed this out to me, that the Privacy Act, basically, prevents you from having to disclose that number to anyone except for the Internal Revenue Service and the Social Security Administration. Isn't that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, the Privacy Act was passed in 1974, and I have studied it widely. Not a few years, but I recall its purpose, and I remember distinctly that it said, like you said, a government agency cannot demand it, or unless the agency has instituted the use of that number or require that number prior to 1974. And very few government agencies have, had such a policy prior to 1974.
Of course, one of the agencies that can, or entities that cannot, by law, demand a Social Security number under the Privacy Act is a bank. But as you know, being a banker, good luck not disclosing a Social Security number to the bank.
Well, that opens up a huge can of worms, and of course, all what has changed since the Real ID Act, and a bank can require it for a lot of reasons. Number one is if they pay interest on your money, then the interest is often taxable, depending on your tax bracket and so forth. But now, if it's what I call a plain Jane checking account, for years and years, there used to be a requirement, I think it's under 31 CFR something, that told the banks basically, you're supposed to get a Social Security number from all customers, and if you don't, you're supposed to put them on a list. And then I presume then that list, if the banking authorities ever came on board and gave your bank an audit, they say, okay, where's your list of those guys that failed or refused to give you their mark of the beast? And presumably the banks would supposed to have that list. Oh, sir, here it is right here. Here's the list of people. So go after them.
Right.
But that's been years and years and years ago, and all that has gone by the wayside, I'm afraid, especially after the Real ID Act.
I remember, back in the 90s and the early 2000s, I remember talking to you about opening a non-interest-bearing checking account without a Social Security number. I remember having that conversation with you. And you were doing that for people, but in later years, and especially after the passage of the Real ID Act, did you continue to do so, or did it just become too difficult to do it?
It became way too difficult to do it. Yeah, I was the bank manager of a couple of banks where I had the authorities to do that, and I guess in those days, going back years ago, it was still legal as long as you kept them on the list. But those days are long gone, and it's impossible nowadays to go into any bank, as far as I know, and open any kind of account without a Social Security number, unless maybe you live in California.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Well, I know that, I was going to say, anybody without a Social Security number could probably open up a bank account at an American bank. All they would have to do is claim to be an illegal alien.
Well, especially if you're in California.
Yeah.
Now, most of the other states, I don't think you can get away with that. But in California, you can. In fact, a little bit off the subject, in California, if you're an illegal alien, you can register to vote. In fact, they even encourage it. So I'm wondering, where in the world has Jeff Sessions been hiding?
Right.
That's off the subject, but I'll throw that comment in for free.
We're getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit with the comment I'm about to make, but maybe what you need to do is go to a DMV in California, and when you get to the front of the line, look at the clerk and say, "Licencia de conductor, por favor."
Yeah, I think California is one of the few states where not only you can register to vote if you're an alien, I think you can still get a driver's license.
So I know you're kind of fighting that battle in Texas right now, but I wonder if you ask very politely in Spanish, would you pass for an illegal in California and get one?
Could I pass for? No, I don't think I could pass for illegal.
Like I said, you'd have to have the whole conversation in Spanish probably. And...
Right, more than likely.
But
if you're Caucasian and live in California, I'm afraid you're quickly becoming in the minority. And no offense against Hispanics in general, especially those that are here legally. I like Hispanics. They have a great work ethic. most of them are Catholic, and that's fine. And they're hard workers and family oriented. So I admire. So I'm not knocking Hispanics in general.
When I left the area of Texas where you're at, and I went to Kansas there for a couple of years and pastored, and then I came back to Texas for a year. But the reason I didn't reconnect with you is because I was down in the Brownsville area. I was down in Raymondville, Texas, down there by the border.
Oh yeah.
And I was down there basically as an interim. It was a short term. They literally brought me in just to serve as the interim until they could find the pastor that they really wanted. But I remember the first day that I was there, I was introduced to the youth pastor of the church, and he was a Hispanic guy. And I remember I made a comment to him that, something to the effect of, being there on the border, that it was, I thought that it was a good thing that as a church, that we had a Mexican for the youth pastor, because it would enable us to reach, a lot wider
audience, sure.
Than being in that part of the state. And
sure.
He looked at me, and I'll never forget this. He looked at me, he said, "Preacher, my grandfather was a Mexican. I was born in San Antonio." And I got an education real quick there, and come to find out that the Hispanics in Texas, they like the illegals even less than the white folks do.
Wow.
Because because they were either born there, or they immigrated there legally, or whatever, but they have some kind of an anchor to Texas and to the United States, and they're even less. They like it even less when people cross the border illegally than the rest of us do. They're far more offended at it even than we are.
I've always wondered about that, but thanks for sharing. And I'm assuming the guy you're talking about, he probably spoke fluently English and Spanish too.
Yes, and this was a different conversation. Of course, we had who knows how many conversations over the course of almost a year that I was there. I know at another time and then there were some others in the church that had expressed this to me as well, that one of the real reasons that they didn't like, the illegals coming across the border was because they took the jobs.
Right.
And not only, did that make less jobs available for everybody else, but when they would go to apply for a job, like this particular gentleman was a welder. And so he would go into some place, to apply for a job, and they would just automatically assume that he was, a lot of times they didn't know him, they would assume he was a Mexican, he was an illegal, and they would offer him, some ridiculous, $4 an hour or something like that. And then when they found out that he was an American, they're like, well, why would we hire you for, $12 an hour, $14 an hour, whatever, when, there's all these guys coming across the border that will work for $4 an hour.
I had never heard that argument.
And he still had relatives in Mexico. I mean, one time I crossed the border with him, and we went down there and visited visited a couple of his aunts and so forth, that were Mexican, that lived in Mexico and so forth. He definitely didn't have any animosity towards Mexican people. He just didn't like the ones that came across the border illegally.
Sure.
And that were messing up the work, the workforce, the work market. He definitely would have never thought about crossing the border and trying to work illegally down in Mexico. Not that there would have been a financial inducement to do so, but.
Thanks for sharing that with me. I wonder if he's in the majority thinking of the Hispanics in this country, or if it's about half and half, because I really think about half of them are, shall I say, biased.
Right.
But it's nice to hear stories like that, and hope there's more and more of them like the guy you're talking about.
But to get back to Texas and the Social Security number, your driver's license. I know a number of years ago you decided you were not going to disclose your Social Security number to the Department of Public Safety there in Texas, who issues the driver's licenses. And I remember for a number of years that wasn't a problem. In fact, I remember you had showed me what you were doing, and I remember for a number of years living in Texas myself and getting a driver's license every 4 years without disclosing a social security number and getting license plates without disclosing a social security number and so forth. But apparently you're telling me now that's become impossible.
I'm afraid so, especially after the Real ID Act. Going back a second, yeah, I remember it very, very well. I last renewed my driver's license on a Friday, January the 28th, I believe it was, in the afternoon in Navasota, Texas, because I had read in the newspaper several days before that Texas passed a new law that was a sub-law of, I hope that your listeners write this down, sub-law of a law that Congress passed a few weeks earlier, and it's federalized as 42 U.S.C. 666. Now the Texas law was some other number, but the federal law was 42 U.S.C. 666. Now, I hope your listeners are listening. Write that down and Google it, and then they call you back or the radio station or whoever and say, hey, that guy Bob in Texas is crazy. Just tell him it's simply a coincidence.
Well, I'm looking at it right now. It's a requirement of statutorily prescribed procedures to improve effectiveness of child support enforcement.
Oh yeah. That was in disguise to pass it because they wanted to crack down on deadbeat dads. And I guess there might be 1 or 2% of deadbeat moms, but they always focus on the deadbeat dads. And supposedly that was to help the state attorney generals track down deadbeat dads and get their money and so on and so forth in case they were behind on child support. But you don't need to, kill an ant with a sledgehammer. And that's basically what the law did. So I went down on a Friday afternoon, 4 months before my birthday, and 4 months before my license expired in 1997, 21 years ago, and renewed my driver's license. And I knew at that time, long before 2001 and the Real ID Act, that it would most likely be the last time I would ever renew my driver's license because I refused to give the state of Texas my social security number, mainly for religious reasons and for privacy reasons too. I have not renewed my driver's license ever since 1997.
So 1997 was the last year that you had renewed your license. Wow, I thought it was later than that because it was as late as, I can't remember now. Was it? It might have been as late as 2004 that I had renewed a driver's license in Texas, doing exactly what you had told me to do, and was able to do it without disclosing a social security number. And I was still, and I left Texas in 2005, and was still able to renew license plates and title cars and things without it.
Well, you can still title a car in Texas. It used to be until just a few years ago. A few years ago, you had to provide your social security number, assuming you had one, to even title a car. But for some strange reason, I don't know why, they left that off the title transfer application form about, I want to say about 6 or 8 years ago. I don't know why, but it was a good thing. But the strange thing is, for years and years, you could own a car in Texas, you just couldn't drive it.
Right.
Without giving them the mark.
And so I remember there was some type of an affidavit I remember that you had shown me. And so I'm guessing that had stopped working for you then in 1997.
Well, by the way, the law went into effect, I think it was on Monday, February the 1st, 1997, that you had to, provide your number. So I went in, the Friday before February the 1st, knowing full well that that might be the last time I would ever renew my driver's license.
I was just surprised that the last time you renewed your driver's license was in 1997. I would have thought it would have been more like around 2006 or 7.
No, it was 1997 on a Friday afternoon.
Refresh my memory. What year did the Real ID Act pass?
Well, it passed in 2005, signed by George W. Bush, and it was snuck in to a must-pass military bill. And oftentimes Congress does. They'll stick in something at the last minute, knowing that the main bill will pass, so they snuck it in. And sure enough, George W. Bush signed it. Now I've got a picture of him signing it on the front page of a magazine called End Time Magazines with Irvin Baxter, which you probably heard of. He's right on subject. I mean, if you pull up his website, every week he has an article about the mark of the beast.
So what do you do then? Because you've been driving essentially without a driver's license since 1997. And I know that you've been pulled over at some point during the last 11 years, or 21 years rather. So what have you been doing for the last 21 years?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Yeah, I've been stopped a few times, like most people. A couple of times right here in North Texas where I live. The case was actually dismissed by a JP that I know a little bit, and to this day I'm not 100% why my case got dismissed. We weren't what you call good friends, but he knows me, my background, my faith, and the case just got dismissed. But I've been stopped maybe 6 or 8 times over the last 21 years. Most of the time, I've just paid the fine and just gone on down the road. One time about 3, maybe 4 years ago, I went to visit my daughter and driving a little Honda, and one of my headlights was out. Got pulled over. I was about half a block from her house, but I got pulled over, stopped, actually spent the night in jail. Pulled over, thrown in jail. I had to spend the night, and the officer said, well, I want you to see the judge. I had to spend the night in jail, had to see the judge the next morning. I said, well, sir, I didn't even get a chance to tell him what my argument was or my reasoning or logic. I just said, well, what are my options, sir? And he said, well, you can plead guilty, you can plead not guilty, and, pay the fine. And I thought about saying, well, I'd like to plead not guilty, but it would be a very, very prolonged situation. So I said, I plead no little contendery, no contest, which is to say that's guilty. Anyway, I paid the fine and picked up my car out of the wrecking yard. Actually, that's a story in itself. And paid the fine and went on home a few days later. But I've got stopped a couple times in the last year. One of them was I hit a neighbor's mailbox. I live out in the country, and I was going down the road, and my cell phone started ringing. I had it deep in my pants pocket, tried to get it, and I hit a neighbor's brick mailbox about a quarter mile down the road from where I live. Totaled my car, absolutely totaled it. Airbag went off. I had a little blood in my mouth and one hand, and the cops called me I walked home. Within about 1 minute, the cops called me. Record came out, ambulance came out. We went round and round and round, and they asked me for my driver's license, of course. And I told them, how old it was, why I didn't renew it, and all that. And no ticket. In fact, the cop drove me down to my car, waited for the record to come pick it up, and took me home, and that was the end of the story.
Of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I've enjoyed the conversation with Bob. He and I haven't talked for a while, so it was almost a catch-up time for us as well as for the radio show. But we do have to cut it off here. Did not get into the details, the nitty-gritties of living without the Social Security number, living without the driver's license, and so forth. I know that is probably of interest to at least some of our listeners. And so what we're going to do is we're going to bring Bob back here in a couple of weeks, and we're going to have that discussion and have him give us the particulars. But at least today you got to find out a little bit about how the banking system works. And I hope that today's conversation with banker Bob Eoff was enlightening. So until next week, thank you once again for joining us here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Check out my website, www.dixieheritage.net. When you're there, sign up for a free copy of our weekly email newsletter, and I'll send you a free copy of my book when you do. God bless.